You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Fishing the DMV. I'm your host, Thomas Ahrens, and today I have a really special guest. I have the Executive Director of the Mighty River Recovery, Joe Balog. Sir, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. I like your podcast.
The SAV, I'm going to call it a crisis for the United States right now, where there's this war on aquatic vegetation, whether it is from all the way up in Connecticut, where they sprayed so much people's dogs were getting killed off because they would drink the water, to the killing of grass that you see on Kerr Reservoir, North Carolina's Gunnersville, and then your area, the St. Johns River. It's absolutely insane. To really just start this thing off for people that have no idea what is going on and how this started, could you give a brief history of how this came to be?
Of Mighty River Recovery, our group, and what we're doing? Yeah, so Mighty River Recovery is kind of the result of a group of people who have seen the documented decline of the St. Johns River in Florida, Central Florida, and the lack of involvement from resource managers to do anything about that decline. So we are the first organized body for freshwater advocacy in the state of Florida that really keys on a lot of the things that we're seeing around the state that are reducing fish and wildlife habitat. You know, what we do primarily can all go back to that habitat issue. The St. Johns River, for people that aren't familiar, the St. Johns River was once known as the bass fishing capital of the world. It was the undisputed leader in tourism, in travel, and people's interest to bass fishing. Is one of the leading first places for organized bass fishing. The Bassmaster Classic was held here early on. The St. Johns River has a history as long in organized bass fishing as any resource in the country, and it was a premier economic and tourism driver of this part of the state for decades, generations, probably close to a century. Throughout the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, the St. Johns River really started suffering a major decline that people in this area of Central Florida took note of. Bait shops went out of business, guides went out of business, hotels, fish camps, all up and down the river. Once had dozens and dozens of fish camps, all for the most part have gone out of business. So what we saw this slow, death to the resource, where it just kept getting worse and worse. Fishing got worse, water quality got worse, fish kills were more prevalent, algae blooms, all kinds of different problems. Throughout that period, 40, 50 years, we went from this major economic driver in this resource that people from all over the country came to, and fell apart into a place where literally there was almost no involvement or interest in the resource. Today on the St. Johns River, which is the biggest freshwater resource in the entire state of Florida, if you went to the boat ramp, the biggest boat ramp on the St. Johns River at 2:00 in the afternoon, you might see 2 or 3 boat trailers. If you went to the same, at the same time to other resources in the state that still have some interest, the Kissimmee Chain, Orange Lake, different places like this, there might be 200 boat trailers. So what we see is this resource that has essentially just been given up on. And as a group, I keep saying the people that were interested in this resource, the remaining fish camps, the anglers, the hunters, the eco tour people, as we started to gather and organize and look at what's going on, and really trying to get more involved with the state, which I'll talk about in a minute, we found that there was no management plan for the St. Johns River. There's no long-term data for the St. Johns River. There's no plan for, a structured plan for habitat restoration on the St. Johns River. It was just throw your hands up and, hey, this is how it is. This is how the river is. And we thought, this is crazy. So we, as a group, founded Mighty River Recovery. And it's a group that includes everyone from tourism professionals to lodging and, like I mentioned, fish camp operators, to professional tournament fishermen, to media people, to certified biologists, fishery scientists, you name it. We have a very diverse group of people that are coming together to try and end the noted documented decline of the St. Johns River and just advocate for a way forward.
Were you the founder? Like, what year did all this really start building?
Well, it started building as an idea probably about 3 years ago.
Okay.
I'm originally from the Midwest, but I had been traveling to Central Florida since I was a very young kid
Oh, cool.
to bass fish. So since about the early 1980s, I've been coming to Florida. In the 1990s and early 2000s, I came and stayed in Florida for weeks and months at a time, mainly to fish and to travel around and to just be absorbed in this, what I found was just the greatest place in the world. In 2014, I moved full time to Central Florida, partly to be close to the St. Johns River. And at that time, I realized that the St. Johns River of 2014 was nothing like the St. Johns River of 1995, as far as the fishing, as far as the resource, the way it looked, the plant communities, the bird life, everything was declining. The shrimp, the crabs, everything was different. So after being here 6 or 8 years and getting to know more people that have had literally multi-generations on the St. Johns River. One of our original founders is I think 7th generation Floridian. So when you have these people that have been here forever and you start to inquire with them, what happened at the St. Johns River? I remember as a young man, they would say, well, that's just the way it is. It's always been going downhill. That's just the way it is. So 3 years or so ago, we started talking, can we do something about it? At the time, I was very involved, and I still am somewhat involved, with the Florida FWC, which is our fish and wildlife people here, as an independent person and media person. And I was sitting in on meetings, and I was listening to the plan, and I was seeing what was going on around the state, and nothing was going on the St. Johns River. So I thought, why is it, how do we put our hand up? We see restoration efforts and attention given to other resources. When is it going to come to the St. Johns River? So a number of us just started thinking, what can we do? We learned more about, how to operate a nonprofit. We saw other nonprofits in the same space within Florida that were getting things done, that were moving the needle for other resources and for other areas of concern, like Everglades restoration of the Indian River Lagoon. And we saw these groups and we said, well, where's the one for freshwater? Where's the one that represents a pontoon boater or a bass fisherman or a crappie fisherman or an airboater? Where's that organization? And it didn't exist, and it still doesn't. So we started Mighty River Recovery to be the first organization of that kind. We're currently taking on the St. Johns River as our primary project. We'll do that, forever, as long as this organization is around. But we see ourselves as possibly a first that could grow, and see some major change to freshwater resources in Florida.
Up in my area, when we had when DuPont, I believe, was the corporation that was spilling God knows how much pollution to the Shenandoah and basically nuked it, there was the River Keepers organization that basically stood up to sue based on the pollutions. And because of St. John's, this is a question I know the comment section will probably ask. Was this were you trying to replicate the river keeper structure basically for the St. John's? Do they not have river keepers for the rivers down in that area of the country?
They do. The river keeper organizations are a very big, well-funded, effective organization. And we do have a group here called the St. John's River Keeper, who we consider one of our partner organizations for certain projects. They do a very good job of keeping an eye, kind of an objective overview eye on a number of issues affecting the St. Johns River. They've been fundamental in fighting a number of things that were major threats, some wins, some losses, a lot to do with nutrient loading, pollution, dredging, runoff, discharges, you name it. The River Keeper does a very good job of that for a lot of the St. Johns River. I think because they're so involved in some of those major issues, I don't know how much time and energy they really have been able to put towards fish and wildlife habitat specifically, which is what our organization does. Gotcha. We look at it that if you can restore fish and wildlife habitat, while that doesn't seem like the greatest thing you have to do in order to have a healthy, clean waterway, you can't have a healthy, clean waterway without having fish and wildlife habitat being in good shape. Because if that's like that's the canary in the coal mine. If you lose all your submerged aquatic vegetation, if you lose your fish populations, if you lose your diversity, you're seeing something that is going to be or already is a larger issue. Chances are it's nutrient loading. Maybe it's pesticides. Maybe it's discharges or withdrawals from your water source. But by restoring fish and wildlife habitat, you have the possibility of really restoring the whole ecosystem. So we're partnering with restoration efforts with the Riverkeeper, and I think we're seeing them expand a little bit to offer more things. But we definitely need more than just one organization for a river that's 350 miles long, and also has some major urban and population centers along it. So yes, we have help there, but no one is really taking the bull by the horns on a number of issues, especially those that the average user, the boater, the angler, is saying every day. Like, what is going on with this or this or this? The things that they're seeing, we're seeing because we're those same people.
As a non-Floridan resident and as a person that just watches, generally speaking, when Bassmaster, what have you, and I tune in to watch what's going on in the St. Johns River, anecdotally, I can see over the years, it was this weird breaking point. I think it was like 2 years ago when you were watching the live feed, like there's no grass left. And
right.
What was rolled off was, it was the hurricane. That's what did it. It was the hurricane.
Right.
If the hurricane didn't come through, it would be lush grass. Can you comment on that thought process?
Absolutely. So that is one of the core concerns and organizing principles of our group. While we saw, there's basically two types of vegetation in the St. Johns River, as people know, Central Florida. There's the stuff that grows on the bottom, submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, eelgrass, milfoil, all those different things that come up off the bottom. Then we have a tremendous amount of floating grass too, or floating vegetation, water hyacinths, pennywort, Cuban bulrush, water lettuce, all these different things that essentially stay on the top. All provide some benefit to not only water purification and helping to clean the water, but also obviously fish and wildlife habitat. So what we saw is after the 2017 and 2018 real high water events that happened after hurricanes, is we saw a lot of the submerged aquatic vegetation in certain parts of the river disappear. Prior to that, we had been watching, as our organization kind of monitors and looks at these things long term, we had been watching losses in that same type of vegetation, submerged vegetation, throughout other places of the river well before those storm events. So we had seen this noted decline where it was just small areas. It was just somebody's little backwater that they live on, or it was one section or one part of one lake further upstream. For instance, Lake Jessup, there was areas that there was a lot of vegetation there that just seemed to disappear 10 or 20 years ago. Lake Monroe has up and down vegetation, seems to be gone for decades at a time. Lake Woodruff near DeLand in Florida had some of the best, maybe the best bass fishery and the best fishing lake in the entire state of Florida for about 20 years. And about 15, 20 years ago, all the vegetation just disappeared. When we saw the high water events and the rest of the vegetation disappear, it became the thing to latch onto. Well, here it is. Here's the problem. We had a hurricane and it killed all the vegetation in this area around where the bass tournament was or a population center was. But we had seen that happening in the river and other places for decades. On top of that, whereas in the past, we've had hurricanes, we've had high water, the vegetation restores itself and comes back usually within a year, 2 years. At this time, it's been 8 years and that vegetation still essentially has not come back at all. We've lost over 90% of the submerged aquatic vegetation in the St. Johns River in Florida, none of which has come back for any. We've had some restoration efforts that have been able to restore a little bit here and there. It comes and goes. Long term, we're still at ground zero with that. So our organization was like watching the same thing you're watching and listening to an announcer say, oh, it was the hurricanes, because that's what our resource manager said or reasoned it to. Whereas the people that have been on this river for 40 years said, that's a lie. There's no way. I can show you places that we had vegetation in 1985 that we haven't had vegetation since 1985. Why is that? It's not the hurricanes. So we're looking into all of the variables that may be causing that. We're the first group that wants to look at everything impartially and say, maybe our theories are right. Maybe the hurricanes were things. We have a reason to believe it's several variables. So we need to look at objectively all those variables to figure out what is causing the habitat decline.
It is fascinating with how many biologists and PhD people that do reports I've had on the show talking, and 90% of the time it's never just one thing. It's there might be one thing that tips the scales to where it's like aha, but it's usually a death by 1,000 cuts. And
Sure.
if you do spray all the backwater areas, the boat dock areas that are generally shielded from high water and the current, if you get rid of that and then the high water comes and rips out what is actually vulnerable to high water, you're right. You're left with nothing for it to build back from. And you see this on the Potomac River too, when we had construction up at Woodrow Wilson Bridge, and all those back areas got completely nuked of grass because of all the construction. And then you have a cold winter that comes through and then eradicates the rest of the vegetation. And there hasn't been grass in the upper part of the Potomac since. And that was 10 years ago. Like people don't appreciate that once you damage something, it's not like you can, especially with grass, especially with the water environment, you can't just fix it. You can't just throw money necessarily at it and always fix a problem immediately.
Right. And you and I talked a little bit before this about referring to some of the slides and everything.
Mm-hmm.
When looking at, there's one that says FWC lowest records. We look at all of the primary, fisheries in the central, the middle basin of the river. And I mean, this is the only hard data that we have from our resource managers looking just at fish. And you can see it's the lowest catch rates on record ever, the lowest recorded catch rates for bass ever, the lowest biomass ever, biomass being everything from invertebrates all the way to alligators. Sampling rates lowest since the records began. So just in 2020 through 2022, that little period there, those 2 years, we set all-time records for the worst conditions and the lowest numbers of fish and game fish and biomass in our fisheries around here. So I just have a hard time believing that when a hurricane comes through Florida, which has been happening since the beginning of time, that the result of it in the last few years has been these bottomed out, horrible, situations for the river and for the fisheries on the river. There's more to it than that, and when we look at what as an answer and a response from the state, what they're going to do about the loss of SAV is they're going to enclose and or plant more SAV. And it's kind of like, you really need, when it comes to resource management, you need to figure out what is the problem before you just add something to the ecosystem and assume that everything's going to be okay. It's the same argument and the same principles for all fish and wildlife management. If you have a lake with no fish and you stock fish in it, in 2 years, you'll have a lake with no fish. There's a reason the lake has no fish. It's a habitat decline. It's a water issue. It's a nutrient issue. It could be a lot of different things, but we have no response and no plan from the state for this resource.
I've been thinking a while about how I wanted to approach this because I feel like it's a chicken or the egg, the spraying versus the culture that leads to the spraying. So I want to start with the cultural impact first, and we'll segue into the spraying because it's the reason you spray is because you have this thought process, this mandate that, generally speaking, it's because it's an invasive. We think it's an invasive plant, therefore we must get rid of it. And so there's an invasive grass allegedly that they are trying to eradicate. Because if it was a protective species, God knows how much red tape if they were out there trying to dump stuff to kill it. What is the thought process there? Because you are trying to do plant restoration, which we'll get into later, but this idea of zero, absolute zero, no hydrilla, no, invasive milfoil, is that even possible? What is the thought process there?
Well, what we have an issue here in Florida in that the management, first of all, we have, to be fair and to be objective, we have resources that are tremendously high in nutrients and excellent at growing vegetation. We're in Florida, so think about that. So water temperatures are warm. We have the possibility to grow a lot of different stuff. And all over the state of Florida, whether it's in the water or on terrestrial environments, whatever, everywhere you look, there are exotic species. There are invasive species, meaning they grow really, really fast. So we have this issue with plant management in Florida that because of our environment, because of our population growth, because of things being, kind of subject in our environment, thrown into our environment, we see massive growth of a lot of things. So at one time, water hyacinths, for example, which are a very quick growing invasive exotic plant, overtook a lot of the waterways in Florida. And without question, if you leave water hyacinths unmanaged in the state of Florida and you let them just run rampant, they will overtake a water body. So will Cuban bulrush and a number of other different plants. Where we have a problem is that the answer to that and the guidelines and the rules and laws and acts that the management communities go by were all drafted for the most part prior to the 1950s, some as far back as the late 1800s. So you had this small population area. You had resource management that really didn't understand general, environmental, holistic, large-scale resource management. And they said, those weeds, those hyacinth weeds need to be killed in order for this, otherwise they're going to take over the water body. So at that time, the thought was, let's kill every single hyacinth we can, every exotic plant we can. And Florida being Florida of the 1800s with lush, natural, native vegetation and fish and ducks and everything being great, let's get rid of the hyacinths and everything will continue to be great. Florida of 2024 is nothing like Florida of the 1890s. It's as different as the Earth to the moon. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is not even comparable. Our population now is thousands of percent higher. Tens of millions of people are in Florida impacting these resources. Nutrient loading is higher than it's ever been impacting these resources. Put and take as far as how much water is coming in and going out. The climate is different. The temperatures are different. The fish are different. Everything is different except for resource management. Resource management has stayed exactly the same. And when we talk to groups like the FWC or the Army Corps of Engineers, they tell us with a straight face that they are mandated to destroy all invasive plants in the waterways of Florida. And by attempting to do so with today's system, with today's nutrient levels, with today's Florida, they are dramatically impacting the environment. And they are dramatically impacting any possibility of native plants to survive or of the waterways to stay healthy. It's become a situation in a lot of Florida, including the St. Johns River, where in an attempt to eradicate invasive plants has led to waterways with no plants, waterways which are now dominated by algae, waterways which are now cloudier and darker and do not allow the growth of the native plants of old Florida, because this system of continuous eradication of invasives has created environments which support almost no life other than gar or shad or low oxygen fish. It's impacting game fish, it's impacting bird life, it's impacting everything that swims in these waterways. So by doing so, and this intolerance towards any other management, we are actually, I believe, causing the resources further decline and further harm. Scientific study backs that up. Mm-hmm. We see other places in the country now that are starting to say, hey, we may not like hydrilla or water hyacinths or whatever it may be, but we need to figure out ways to control them objectively, not impartially. We need to allow them in certain areas, allow access while also allowing some vegetation, all these different things and different variables. And we see overall healthier environments that are more useful to people, that are more desirable for people to fish and to recreate in. Texas is a perfect example. Yes. And when you take a big picture type of approach and you look at where Florida's at with that, Florida's freshwater resources are declining all over the state. And tourism is declining and fishing is declining, one after another after another. And the only thing that hasn't changed is management. It's totally intolerant to the thought that we need to do something else. We're not saying we don't have to control invasive plants. That's crazy. And we're not saying that we don't have to potentially use herbicides to control some of those plants. But what we are saying is we cannot go out and kill every single invasive plant the minute we see one in Florida with herbicide spray, and think that the waterways are going to be healthy forever. That's ludicrous.
Well,
That's
it's chemotherapy. It's chemotherapy. Yeah. And it's this idea, this thought process that if we just kill everything, the natives will grow back. And it's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
I mean, you can even take their own argument and break it down. And that to me is what's fascinating is they'll say like this invasive, it will outcompete the native. So we'll kill all of it and then be shocked when, if anything grows back, it's the invasive that can't. Right. Like hydrilla is a classic example of this because it'll grow anywhere. And before we go too far down this rabbit hole, something you mentioned earlier, which is the studies done in Florida because it's a tropical environment. You know, some lakes are barely 8 feet. This is why I constantly, when I have other biologists from different parts of the country, I say we cannot reference Florida studies. You are in upstate New York. Your reservoir is 300 feet deep. Tell me how the studies done in Florida will relate to that place, or Toledo Bend, that's 100,000 acres, extremely deep. They need to do different studies on the impacts of SAV in different regions of the country, not just Florida, and using that Florida study as the blueprint for everywhere, because a Canadian watershed or a glacier lake is completely different than in Florida, where I understand the validity that if your lake is 8 feet deep, yes, there might be an issue where there's overgrowth. We can have that discussion, but you can't just take that as the Bible everywhere you go.
Yeah, and it's even scarier. First, resource management is kind of a learn as you go process, and a lot of people are somewhat surprised by that. I went to school in the early '90s for resource management. I have a degree in fishery science and management from Michigan State, so I was taught the textbook type of things of vegetation, wildlife populations, food webs. So, but in general, a lot of what happens as the world changes is trial and error type of studies, trying things with resources. There's not necessarily a great book out there that says how to manage water hyacinths and still have a great bass fishery. There's people that are trying different things. They're learning from each other. They're spreading some of this, but it's really kind of not a refined scientific approach with a lot of this stuff. That's okay, and that's where we're at. But the other thing to keep in mind is most of the studies that were done on invasive plants, especially here in Florida, were done in controlled environments. They weren't done in our resources. They weren't done on the St. Johns River. So what we have is we have companies that are advocating for herbicides. We have management that is utilizing certain methods. And the only data that they really have to go on is data from retention ponds about how fast hyacinths grow, or how effective their product is at killing one plant but not another. There's never been one of those studies done in the wild in Florida that we're aware of. So we see these numbers. Hyacinths can double in size in 15 days. But I go on the river and I see hyacinths and I fish there. And when I come back 15 days later, there's not twice as many hyacinths. And I say to myself, well, what's the deal here? And it's because they're competing with lily pads and pennywort and bulrushes and cattails and whatever other vegetation and the nutrient level may go up and down. Today, it's 38 degrees outside. The hyacinths aren't doubling in size today. They're dying today. So I'm asking myself, why is it that our management is going along with these principles? So we, as Mighty River Recovery, are one of the first groups that's going to say, okay, we're going to do some studies. We're going to get some data, and then we're going to challenge some of the management practices based on what we see as real world data.
When it comes to the spraying, is it funded? Is it Florida directly doing the spraying? Are they subcontracting out to another business? Is this the Army Corps of Engineers? Is it all the above? How does it work?
Florida has basically 3 different government entities throughout the state that do the majority of herbicide work. The Florida FWC, Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, is in charge of fish and wildlife resources and managing most of the resources in Florida. We have separate water management groups throughout the state of Florida who control kind of keeping water supplies for development, for cities, keep making sure that what's coming in, what's going out, and they also have a little bit of say of some invasive species type stuff and some spraying. And then the Army Corps of Engineers, of course, being a federal group, they have the obligation of keeping navigational waterways free and clear of invasive plants that may restrict navigation. So navigational waterways include Lake Okeechobee and St. Johns River and a few other select places throughout the state of Florida.
Interesting.
So for us, we have all three groups that can make an impact when it comes to herbicide use. You would think that there would be an overreaching code or some kind of law in the books that says anybody can do this, or we have a plan in place for contractors or different organizations. However, the resource must stay at this level of being healthy, or it may not impact fish and wildlife. But in fact, in Florida, the FWC has some rules and laws like that on the books, which can be kind of overrode, let's say, by the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers, and their policy being federal, has the ability to kind of, I don't want to say do what they want, but to some extent make sure that navigational and flood risk is by far the number one driver. So if they say we want clear straight lanes, no plants, no fish, the heck with it, they actually have the ability to do it. Again, they're relying on some rules and laws that go back over 100 years. So our thought process in our organization is to not only get people aware of that and let people know that, exactly what's going on, but also figure out what are we going to do to dialogue with these people, to talk to these management agencies and see like what is the long-term plan? What are we going to do so that it's not just this strong arm move when it comes to our fish and wildlife habitat? So just getting to the bottom of all this in Florida has been a year-long process. I mean, just emails and learning and reading laws and acts and codes and legislative mumbo jumbo and everything. It's been a full year of just getting educated because it's so in depth and it's so complicated. And that's one of the things that's different about our group. The people and the citizens and the users of the resources in Florida, they just throw their hands up. They're like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know. We see this and then we hear this and we see this and we hear this, and it's like, and everything goes around in circles. And so that's really the fault of our managers.
It's the bureaucracy of it all. It's, and this is why I get paranoid when people talk about putting new laws in the books. It's like, you got to be damn sure that thing's written correctly and you dot your I's before you throw laws, because they never get repealed. And we're dealing with like, this was the book done during World War II. I had the Army Corps of Engineers on for Kerr Reservoir, and they talked about like, this thing was built when the D-Day landings were going on. That's how old some of these lakes are. And they're using the same rules, 2 generations ago. It's insane. Yeah. But it's like, once government stuff gets ingrained, it's hard to make changes. It is.
Yeah. And I mean, to give you some indication, our rules and laws that they're still going by were based at the kind of the beginning of steamship travel to Central Florida. So that's, prior to World War I. The Rivers and Harbors Act, I believe it was either 1895 or 1899, is the number one referenced act, which has been revised a number of times, is the number one referenced act that the Army Corps of Engineers uses for flood and navigation concerns with invasive plants. It's written in the early 1900s, prior to World War II. There's parts of that are written in about completely eradicating invasive plants. And to this day, the Army Corps of Engineers still cites that as their reason for the destruction of the habitat. Over 100 years later, that is and don't get me wrong, we need navigable waterways, we need flood control, we need all these things on this big, massive body of water. But the complete intolerance towards any kind of impact, to the environment is where we feel like we can come a long way. I mean, we're not recognizing that. We need to.
And I think it's a good segue to this one slide you have here with legislative spend. I want to make sure, let me share my screen here. Present share. And there we go. Sharing. There we go. Yeah. Walk us through this. What is going on here?
Yeah, that's just a quick grab for when we're talking to groups in our area. For instance, we have seen the legislative budget for the state of Florida the last few years increased to a number of environmental projects. A lot of groups are making, the decision makers in Florida aware of the fact that our continued decline in our resources is leading to major economic decline, when hotels lose all their business and the beaches close. So with that being said, there is some significant spending in 2024. There was some significant spending towards different programs that are concentrating on the Indian River Lagoon or the Caloosahatchee River or the Keys or coral restoration, springs restoration. We see all this stuff, and that the average person, though, can go down through there and look at those big numbers and those number one spends, and none of them say anything about the St. Johns River. And you say it's so strange, because you ask yourself, this is the largest freshwater resource in the state, but out of billions and billions of dollars, billions go to Everglades restoration every year. Where is the money for the St. Johns River? And it's never been allocated. There's been almost no money for any projects in the last probably 20 years that have anything to do with fish and wildlife habitat on the St. Johns River or the environmental problems with the St. Johns River. But yet we see people continuously leaving. Go if you would too. Go to that one, that how did we get there slide that we loaded up earlier. That's just a general graph of what it looks like to operate a fish camp in Central Florida, where you have professional guides fishing what was once known as the bass fishing capital of the world. In the 1980s, they booked almost 300 trips a year out of one small fish camp, which by 2023 has all gone all the way down to about 3. So, I mean, if that's not a glaring example of, commerce or economic problems following the loss of a resource, I mean, and then multiply that times every hotel and every bait shop and every drugstore and gas station along the river, they're just continuously losing out. But then the legislative spends are all towards other resources. A big part of that, and a reason for that, is there hasn't been a unified, organized group, squeaky wheel gets the grease type of thing. There hasn't been anybody really advocating. It's just been an accepted thing along the river. People go elsewhere to fish. People go elsewhere to ride their pontoons around, or people go elsewhere to see wildlife. So we want to change that. We want some of those spends to come back here. There's a little bit of money that's being allocated towards one project in 2025, but it's still really, we're a long way to go for any attention from the state. So we feel that by building the biggest group we can and getting the word out there that we're tired of it and that we want better, people can align behind us, and we can go to the state and we can talk about some of those numbers and some of that funding.
What kind of friction is there from homeowners associations, residents, and what you're doing? Because I know in places, we haven't brought it up yet, like Lake Gunnersville, where you have a big community drive there to eradicate all of the grass or all the invasive, as it said in some of the wording. Is that as much of an issue on the St. John's as compared to other places?
No. And the reason for it is the river is really unique, and that the lower basin of the river, where it's bigger and wider, and that's down around Jacksonville and major population centers, it's kind of a different waterway and it's a different ecosystem than the middle and upper parts. The lower part really doesn't have any problem with invasive plant growth to the biggest extent. It's lost all its submerged vegetation, but a lot of the big issues that you see in other parts of the river don't affect the lower end. And there's really nothing in place that we're doing that would say, hey, you're going to, lose access, or you're going to have to fight with all these invasive plants in order to use your boat dock or to enjoy the water. In fact, we've seen studies that we've done early on and people we've talked to, there's been a tremendous loss in home and property values while they continue to go up everywhere in Florida. They're not going up as fast on the St. Johns River. And there's areas in and along the St. Johns River where people can't sell a home to save their lives because there's very little left of the resource for anyone to recreate other than just, go sit at a tiki bar or ride their boat up and down it. The fishing has fallen apart. There's just no desire for people to be there. So most people along the river are hopeful that we can restore the river, especially the fishing and some of the ecotour benefits. In other parts of the river, as we move further south, the river on one side is bordered by the Ocala National Forest, which is the largest national forest in Florida, and it's bordered on the other side by the Lake Woodruff Wildlife Refuge, National Wildlife Refuge. In fact, it's the only place in the state of Florida that has a refuge, a wildlife refuge on one side of a waterway and a national forest on the other. So we have huge, huge amounts of protected land, all of which are there as the benefit for fish and wildlife habitat, none of which is being managed for the benefit of fish and wildlife habitat. So we have very little potential conflict with homeowners or things. There are some places that flood concerns and navigation are a concern, small areas that we definitely understand, and we want to make sure that those areas stay, to the benefit of people. But most of the river is made up of alligators, manatees, and fish, and all of those want better management.
What about the Lake George area and some of these like back canals that you see, like that happens every time on Elite Series? Are they doing spraying or asking for spraying? Did that help this snowball effect?
The communities that you see that would be like canals and different things, which if you look at a map are very, very small and very, square surface area, very, very small. I would guess, without knowing people or talking to people, that they want to keep their canals free of vegetation for the most part, and I get it, and I think they should. But I also think that even in the places where we currently manage invasive plants with herbicides, where the program is to come in and spray herbicides 2 or 3 times a year, why in the world are we not just manually removing those plants? I mean, it's flabbergasting to me. I don't know how many people, that might not be from this area understand, but hyacinths, pennywort, water lettuce, these plants are floating on the surface of the water. They're primarily made up of water. Over 90% of the plant is water. You literally can reach down and pick them up and take them away, in which case they actually do make good fertilizer, compost, and even animal feed. Yet our program is 3 times a year to go in someone's canal, blast it with pesticides, including some that may have dangerous chemicals in them, like glyphosate, which we're still learning more about, the Roundup chemical, that's in these pesticides and herbicides. And they're spraying them all over people's backyards and canals and waterways where they recreate, instead of doing some other type of harvest or taking the plants out manually. It would be much more effective and much better long-term for the resource to do that. The complaint and the reasoning for that forever has been, it's simply too expensive to go manually harvest these plants. But yet the state of Florida is now spending in excess of $40 million annually on herbicides, on chemicals. That's a lot of money.
It's a business.
Billions of dollars they're doing for restoration efforts everywhere else. How much, what would it take to get some funding to have a group come in and actually start to pull some of these plants out by hand and utilize those plants, or if nothing else, get rid of them? The funding is there. The money concern is not an argument anymore. Chemical costs are through the roof. It's just the same old practice in the same old way. And we don't think that that's really the best way forward.
It's also
times have changed.
Yeah, it's also like Big Pharma, though. There's a lot of money being made doing it this way, how it's always been. And that is terrifying. And something that we haven't talked about yet, which you have a great video on that I'll share here in a second, is when you kill this vegetation, what happens? It's not just you spray, it dies, and everyone lives happily ever after. Like, it decomposes.
Yeah, again, we always take a step back and ask fish and wildlife habitat concerns, what is going on here? And the principle of that we'll just spray vegetation and we'll allow it to sink to the bottom. This is a video that, just another social reel. We do a lot of these on our website or on our social media. This is what vegetation looks like about a week after it's sprayed. It literally just disintegrates. Not to mention that when we go into those plant communities that aren't sprayed and we look around at those plant communities, they're full of invertebrates. They're full of insects and crawfish and salamanders and you name it. They're full of life. of the food web driving these fisheries. But now they're full of nothing. They're full of wasted material that sinks to the bottom year after year after year. And what that does is it makes it impossible for any other plants to grow, nearly impossible for invasive plants to grow. It clouds the water permanently. And it's just a general fallout of the ecosystem. I mean, I've always felt like with Mighty River Recovery that if we took a step back and kind of objectively looked at management in Florida and what we're doing, it would be glaring to anyone with any kind of, head on their shoulders that the way we're managing these resources cannot sustain itself. If every year, instead of cutting my grass, I sprayed my grass with Roundup, and when it died back, I sprayed it with Roundup, after 20 years, I will not have any grass. I promise you. And that's essentially what we're doing with these resources in Florida, year after year after year. Not to mention, we're not even considering what we're doing to the environment.
If you do that for years and years and years, and you just have layers upon layer of decomposing aquatic life, what are the longer term impacts? I'm assuming just more sediment, more buildup of muck.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's right up there in the same list of things we've never really conclusively studied in Florida. There has been no effort by the state of Florida to say, hey, if we spray, herbicides on our vegetation for 50 or 100 years, what's going to be the long-term impact to our resource? Never been studied. So we see, and anyone that's been on the river for a long period of time see huge buildups of muck, of material, degraded material. Not only is that material now not useful to the organisms that break it down, because it didn't die naturally, it died with herbicides and with chemicals. So it's not being utilized by a lot of the benthic community and a lot of the community that breaks down that material. But what it's doing long term is it's not allowing the river to really regenerate itself or to grow any beneficial plants or to have any good spawning habitat for game fish. It's just creating this sludge on the bottom. And there's even thoughts that because it's such fine particulate matter that it gets cycled into the water column a lot easier. It gets stirred up with wind or with current or with boat activity, and it causes even less light in the water column, which causes even less chance for any beneficial plant life to grow. And we're moving towards, scientifically speaking, an algae-driven community. And you see that with resources that are routinely treated this way. You see that, say, in retention ponds. When you first dig a retention pond and there's cattails and there's 2 or 3 different kinds of vegetation and there's fish and everything, and you move down after treating and it becomes this brown water you can't see through that nothing grows in. It's algae dominated. The nutrients are still there. There's more nutrients than ever in the water in the St. Johns River. They have to go somewhere. Instead of going into growing beneficial plants, they're growing algae, some of which could even be toxic algae. So, there has not been a study of muck buildup and bottom sedimentation. We, again, are one of the first groups that say we need to address this and recognize it. We're looking around and seeing this, and we're saying to ourselves, this is the plan? We're just going to keep doing this? This can't be the plan. But there is no plan. So that's why we're trying to make sure that the bigger the group we have, the better a chance we get a plan. I mean, that's where we're at.
I know this is outside your purview, but it is close to home with the Okeechobee situation. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you can comment on that? Because I will give Scott Martin, God bless his soul, one prop is he is someone that is an advocate for that and talks about it and how Okeechobee has changed for how Florida uses it when it comes to water levels and such.
Mm-hmm. To sum up, our group is focused solely on the St. Johns River. And people actually, since the beginning of our group and the recognition that we're one of the first groups kind of, I don't want to say standing up to the way things are, but really grabbing and trying to organize the community. They say, why don't you do it for all of Florida? Why, how can you help me in this place? And we always say, join us regardless. Someday we'll have, a blueprint in place to move this thing around the state. But when it comes so it's not professionally, and what I keep up with, it's really not for me to say what's going on Lake Okeechobee. But I do keep up with it. And I do keep up with all different sides of it. That's a much bigger animal because of the discharges that are coming from Lake Okeechobee, which are fueling toxic algae, which are fueling red tide, which are affecting the beachside communities, which are destroying the estuaries in the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers, which are responsible without question for major destruction of those ecosystems. They're trying to figure that out. And by doing that, and by trying to change some of the flow of water in different places and what's happening with the Everglades, Okeechobee's kind of caught in the middle. There's major agriculture interests. There's also Everglades restoration interests. There's high water. There's low water. They can't hold the lake high forever and expect it to be a viable, good freshwater fishery or a healthy freshwater environment. It just can't be done. So at one time, Okeechobee probably was reduced in size, throughout the course of history, where it would, go way, way down and way up, like all the fisheries in Florida, all the places in Florida. But there's more to it. Like if you said, oh, I operate a fish camp on Okeechobee and I'm a bass fisherman, you would say, we need to get this water down right now. I don't care where the water goes, get rid of it. But if you owned a hotel on the beach and you saw discharges destroying your estuary and fueling red tide, you would say, don't you bring that water to me. Or if you fished in, the Stewart area, where the whole areas over there that used to be pristine grass flats and great redfish fishing and trout fishing are now barren moonscapes, you would say, enough with the Okeechobee water. That is not all figured out yet, but it's a complex situation with a lot of different parties involved.
Is the grass die-off that you're seeing, no pun intended, downstream of Okeechobee due to the fact that there is the grass in Okeechobee is not what it used to be, to help filter that out? What is the exact reason for that? Because I think it's interesting with the Chesapeake Bay, with the St. John's.
And again, I'm not,
No.
There's a lot of people that you could talk to that, that are involved in Everglades restoration and different things that know a lot more about it. But one of the main problems is when Lake Okeechobee was kind of plumbed to enable it to support a huge agriculture base in South Florida, a lot of the water from Okeechobee goes east and west to each coast. And when it does that, it now is starting to go to marine environments. So you're taking freshwater high in nutrients from Lake Okeechobee and sending it into saltwater communities that have saltwater vegetation at a certain salinity level, and you're changing the salinity level, and you're changing the color of the water, and you're changing all those things, and it's just wiping out the intercoastal along these areas that are estuaries for saltwater. So it would be the same as taking water from the Ohio River and pumping it into, Chesapeake Bay, down near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, all over the oysters or whatever. You have a different water, you have a different thing. So again, that's not our expertise, but one thing that we do at Mighty River Recovery is really monitor a lot of these other resource challenges in Florida. Like you showed that list of all these places that are getting funding, and we're asking ourselves, what's going on? How are they organizing? What are the wins and losses? How are they working the political system? Where do we have to go to see? And some of the groups for Everglades restoration have been very successful as far as securing funding and actually moving forward a major project, which is an unbelievably monumental project. What we want to know, what are they doing? Because why aren't we seeing any involvement in the St. Johns River? So we look at these things and we keep up with them quite a bit. I mean, you have to be somewhat impartial and keep up on all the sides of resource management.
Yeah, you definitely have to. And you mentioned restoration. One of the neatest things I saw that you guys promote on your social media that you don't see a lot of places is gating off and trying to restore SAV.
Right.
It's insane. I don't see that. I think North Carolina is starting to do a little bit more, but there's not a lot of places that do that or practice that.
Yeah, you've got a slide there that says enclosure efforts. Yeah. So I think you should.
Yep. Hold on. Let me get this up for you.
So again, our group recognizes this decline in SAV and habitat in fish and wildlife. And one of the things early on that was a project that was started by the state of Florida, by the Florida FWC, was they went to Lake George. Now, Lake George is the second biggest body of water in the state of Florida, second biggest lake behind Okeechobee. This giant, massive lake that as early as 2012, 2014, supported phenomenal growth of SAV, of eelgrass and water lilies and a lot of native vegetation. It was, as close to looking at old school Florida as you could get. Tremendous fishery, tremendous commercial fishery for crab, for mullet, for shrimp. So we had all this lush vegetation that all disappeared about 2017 and 18. The state of Florida came in, and as the vegetation was starting to regenerate itself, they found that something was continuously eating it. Their solution to that was to start building these enclosures. Our group, you can see that's us on the bottom, with some of our volunteers working to build some of these enclosures with the FWC. Our group actually headed up the volunteer efforts. We provided the manpower for a lot of this. And through a number of efforts, they built, 5 and 10 acres in size, these enclosures all over Lake George and areas further downriver. And they found that a lot of them grew SAV really, really well. The state kind of looks at it as, hey, this is the solution to our problems. Our organization looks at it kind of as, hey, we'll help you because we want SAV, we want habitat, but we need to address, why isn't it growing itself? What are we holding out of these enclosures? Does water chemistry have anything to do with it? Are the manatees eating it? What's going on? There's been really no conclusive studies done. And the end result is the enclosures, some have been working to grow some SAV and some haven't. So starting this year, we're actually going to partner with the Riverkeeper organization to hopefully build some additional enclosures and continue to work with the state on some of theirs as this project continues to be, we kind of work the bugs out of this project. It's again, there's not a manual or a book where you can look up how to grow and how to enclose eelgrass on the St. Johns River in Florida. The logistics, the size of the poles, the size of the mesh, the material, how far to put the poles in, what to use to secure it. All those things have been trial and error. The project's been going on for about 5 years. End result is right now it's not real strong. But we're learning as we go, and we believe that as we start to look at some of these other variables and other stressors on the river, this could be one way to really start to recharge some of the habitat and give it a head chance. So we're involved in it. We have people signing up to do it all the time. We want to do more of it, but we want to do it along with other projects.
This is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that picture that's on the right there. Outside the enclosure is a sand bottom with not the first bit of vegetation, and inside is eelgrass topped out all the way to the surface. So, I mean, and that's a matter of only 3 months. 3 months, wow. Florida will grow grass that fast. So, but is it feasible to think we're going to enclose the entire body, the entire river? Probably not. What is feasible is to figure out why is it that it's growing some places and not others, and use the enclosures as another way to gather data and study what's going on and figure out what we need to do to correct maybe some things that might be a bigger problem.
Can you anecdotally just speculate a guess as to why, when it comes to why do you think it'll grow some places and not others? Could you hazard a guess?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I think what's happening with the St. Johns River with habitat is I think a number of variables have contributed to an environment that is no longer growing plants, bottom-rooted plants. And I think that certain places it can still get over the hump to some degree, and other places it can't. And I think it's just everything is teetering right on the edge of not having a hospitable environment for any plant growth. Just like, you get weeds in your driveway, there's a couple places those weeds can sprout up. There's enough moisture, there's a crack, it gets just the right sun, and it could still get it done. But the rest of the place in that, gravel parking lot, it can't get it done because the environment's not right. Whereas we had a very, an environment that allowed us to have a lot of vegetation at one time. Now we have an environment that is so stressed that it's almost impossible for the vegetation to grow. We speculate and conversate on this all the time. Why is it when we enclose areas, they will grow? Is it because so many things are eating them? Or is it because the environment is so stressed and the grass is so stressed to begin with that even the smallest little thing that eats them kills them. Whereas it used to be, hey, I'm eelgrass, I'm growing like, in this great environment. And when turtles or manatees come in and feed, the grass just grows back even thicker and fuller, like it's getting pruned. Now the same animal comes in and feeds, and it actually kills the grass because it's so stressed and it's so weak. Some of these things we've seen in these enclosures where the vegetation will grow and all of a sudden it'll die on its own and its roots are all decayed. And we wonder what is causing that. Is it how much oxygen is in the soil? Is it a pesticide or a herbicide that's in the soil? Is it something to do in the water? Is it, there's exotic fish. There's one more slide too, if you wanted to reference it, that shows some of the stressors of the St. John's called ugly water. Our numbers of exotic fish in the system, specifically tilapia and some fish frequently referred to as armored catfish, are just through the roof in a lot of places of the St. John's River. And you wonder, we don't have any studies to say what are those doing to affect the environment? How are they affecting our vegetation? So again, we just have to look at all these different variables.
It's interesting to me that none of these studies have actually been done before.
Yeah.
But again, it's like, that's the thing that I've been saying forever on this channel is we need more studies, not less. Like we need more information up to date on what is going on. And let me get this other slide up here.
And again, it's easy for people to sit back and say, I can't believe they've never done for instance, the top right, those are tilapia. You go to areas of clear water areas of the St. John's River, you don't see bass swimming around. You see those swimming around. And tilapia eat vegetation, and tilapia eat algae that forms on other vegetation. So you wonder how much impact is that? You'll see sometimes, you reference the Bassmaster show when they fish around in the spring and they fish around bedding bass in the spring areas, and they'll show an aerial and you'll see all of these fish beds. Those aren't bass beds. Those are tilapia beds. So, to the left of that, that's the aftermath of some spraying, some herbicide spraying. That's what your water looks like when you're done. You wonder what's going to grow in that. And then the bottom right, those are all dead bass in a big area of vegetation that have floated up after a flood. So, those weren't killed from somebody spraying them. Those were killed from high water and from the reduction in oxygen. But you wonder, if that's happening on a regular basis, how's that affecting our fisheries? So none of those things are being studied. None of the impacts of those things are really being studied. But again, it's not so much that the resource management community or somebody says, oh, the heck with it, we don't care. There's a certain amount of funding that goes to certain areas. And that's determined by, who makes the most noise or who's got the best political connections or where the resource is determined to be the most in trouble. Nobody's made the noise correctly for the St. John's River. So we're here to do that. And again, we have to start somewhere. There's just no data. So we're drawing a line in the sand and saying we need, even if it takes 20 years, we need data. We need to know what's going on and why this resource is in the shape that it's in and what we can do to move forward. I feel like 5, 6, however many years down the road, we'll look back and we'll say it was this, and this that were the 3 primary drivers, or whatever it may be. It's probably not going to be one thing, but right now we're not studying any of them. So it's time that we start figuring out what's going on to end the decline.
Joe, we've covered so many things today, and I really appreciate you giving up some of your time here. If people want to support you, if people want to get involved, where do they go?
Well, Mighty River Recovery, of course, has a website, mightyriverrecovery.org. We're also very involved on social media, Facebook and Instagram. And you could sign up for a newsletter, you can donate, you can become a member. Our membership platform's, a very affordable membership platform. It's $20 to be a member of Mighty River. It gives you kind of exclusivity to a bunch of the projects that we're involved in. You can volunteer to help us if you're in Central Florida to build enclosures or to do a number of things we're doing in the environment. We want to grow in size. We want to get involved with the community, with the fishing community, with the outdoor community. Everybody on our board and everyone that is involved in our group are outdoor focused people. Everything from we've got one lady on our board whose father was a commercial fisherman on the river, multi-generation. We've got captains and guides and you name it. And we're all just really pushing for a way. So we're your people. You know what I mean? We are not just some nerdy science group or some political group. We are our outdoor users of the river. So we want more people like us, because our numbers are what are the most important part of this thing changing. So we have to build our numbers, and we're building every day. We're going to meetings, we're doing things, but we're in the water and we're doing stuff. So you're going to see us out there. You're going to see our boats out there, the whole bit. But we desperately need help in form of people, funding, the whole bit. And you can find all that on our website. And we're involved with all the bass fishing communities and things that you've mentioned. We've been in Bassmaster. We'll be at their tournaments. We're part of Major League Fishing, you name it. So we just want more involvement from people.
The Mighty River Recovery, ladies and gentlemen. As always, link in the episode description, everything that we talked about. Please go support them. I think this is going to be a domino effect where we're going to see this more culturally in the zeitgeist of fishing in general, not just, in Florida, but I think it's going to catch on all across the nation. And it really was because of you and what you guys did that you kind of sparked the flame to make this work.
It's weird. It's everybody's got a thing. And my thing was, I came to Florida as a kid to fish. And it was like I was going to another world. It was like a dream, and it would keep me fueled all year long to come to Florida. And when my whole life, I wanted to move to Central Florida. And when I got here, I was so disappointed that nobody cared about it as much as I did. And when I reach people and I talk to people, even on my board, they say, I don't know what it is, but you're the guy. And it's really, really important to me. And it may not be important to everybody, but if it's important to whoever's listening to this, believe me, we're your group. I'm your guy. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to try and fix this thing once and for all, or at least have a group in place that says, this is unacceptable. We need to move forward with our thinking. Everybody else has it. Why can't we have it in Central Florida? It's super important.
It is.
So,
it is. And if we don't fight now, it will be gone forever. And so we need somebody to hold the line like what you guys are doing.
Yeah. And the businesses, this is a multi-million, billion-dollar industry in Florida. We're the number one tourist state for fishing and outdoor recreation in the country. Freshwater fishing is huge. And the decline in it is just, it's flabbergasting to me that nobody's done this yet. I couldn't believe it when I looked around. I said, I want to be a member of something. I'm a member of Ducks Unlimited. I'm a member of Bass. I'm a member of Major League Fishing. I want to be a member of something. Who's concerned about freshwater advocacy in Florida? Who's standing up for? And the group I found was Save the Manatee. And I like manatees, but what about fishermen? What about outdoor people? What about eco people? Recreational people. Who's their organization? And there wasn't one. So we started Mighty River, and we're going to be that organization, at least for the St. John's to start. But yeah, I have a feeling this is going to be catching on. Well, we have enough on our plates with a 300-mile long river. I can tell you that.
Well, hey, the River Keepers organization started with one river, and then it exploded. And I that's where I can kind of see this, because you hit it the nail on the head. Just as my closing thought, that they have so much on their plate, the River Keepers, at this big macro view, and having this organization on the micro view, specifically targeting, the habitat and the fish population, is so freaking important. But guys, go check them out. Link in the episode description. Like, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time on Fishing the DMV. Bye. You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.